Okay, so hi, welcome back. Today we have continuing this talk, this time on derived categories of sheaves.
Thanks. So I forgot to mention last time, there is another reference, which is some notes on my webpage. I think they're also linked to now on the similar webpage. So this is really a reference for like the very first section of my talk last time, which is the sort of foundations discussion. And there's a note of higher categories for engineers. Then on either my webpage or the seminar webpage at 22, it's basically just goes into a little bit more detail, the same kind of spiel that I gave in that discussion on the foundation. So it goes into more detail about kind of the nature of higher groupoids, the sort of things that are permitted in the homotopian variant sort of syntax, and then also goes into more detail on complete single spaces, which, as I mentioned, are kind of nice as a homotopian variant definition of higher categories if we're kind of given higher groupoids as an. So anyway, if you read that, maybe absorb that definition in single spaces, a lot of the statements that I made last time become precise statements which you can try to check, right? All right, so I guess I'll sort of start where you left off, which was talking about stable categories. I guess I just have a couple things to say about that. So functor, this is some terminology which is also used in ordinary category theory in this form. So a functor f is called left, respectively right, exact. That preserves finite limits, respectively finite colimits. So this is, in the context of abelian categories, this is the same as the sort of more familiar definition of left and right exact, with preserving exact sequences and so on. And of course, exact is it's left and right exact. So something very kind of different happens in theory of stable categories compared to abelian categories. So let me state this proposition. Many of these propositions I'm stating are also very doable exercises to trying to use these definitions. So in case C and D are actually stable, I have a functor from between two stable categories and following their equivalent. So being left exact, right exact, and then of course, when those are equivalent, that's the same as being exact. Okay, again, it's very strange if you're used to thinking about abelian categories, but in the context of stable categories, because we have this condition that squares are Cartesian if and only if they're co-Cartesian. In fact, preserving finite limits and finite colimits is equivalent for functors between scalar categories. So there's sort of only one class of nice functors between stable categories, and that is the notion of exact functor between stable categories.
So there's no relation between exactness on stable categories and exactness of the functor on the homotopy categories?
Yeah, so let me say what that is. So that's this exact, where C and D are stable. There's an induced functor on the homotopy categories. Remember, these are canonically triangulated categories, and this is going to be canonically triangulated. Which, again, in the context of triangulated categories and ordinary category theory, being triangulated is a structure, right? This is another place where you see how nice stable categories are, because in the world of stable categories being exact as a condition, on the level of homotopy categories, you can endow with a triangulated structure, which remember means in particular that it sends exact triangles to exact triangles. So that's basically what you think about this condition being exact. It sends exact triangles to exact triangles. And of course, in triangulated categories, typically very often you construct them as derived categories of some abelian categories. If I start with some, say left exact functor between two abelian categories, typically what I do is I pass to the derived categories. There's a corresponding right derived functor. And even though the original functor wasn't right exact, the right derived functor preserves exact triangles, right? By construction, that's kind of the point of it. So in this context, in stable categories, sort of all reasonable functors are exact, corresponding to the fact that functors on triangulated categories, usually we would only consider the ones that are triangulated, preserve exact triangles. Okay.
So do you have any typical examples?
Of exact functors?
Yeah.
Yeah, like any derived functor of a functor between abelian categories. Like, again, if I haven't sort of gotten to this point, but if I have an abelian category, there's a corresponding derived category. It's a triangulated category, but there's a natural kind of higher categorical enhancement. Instead of passing to the homotopy category, I can just consider complexes without modding homotopies. And the derived functor on the chain level will be exact in this sense. Again, it's just saying derived functors preserve exact triangles. That's kind of the point of derived functors, right? So, yeah, any derived functor between derived categories and abelian categories, understood as in the higher categorical sense, is going to be an example of this sort of thing. So any functor you work with the moment, we'll have this one.
So let me ask some very stupid questions. So for instance, for the geometric Sataki, how would you upgrade it?
How would I upgrade geometric Sataki functors and equivalence between representations of a line and stool group and reverse sheaves on the sort of Hecke stack? Well, depends on what you mean. I mean that's an equivalence of abelian categories, right? But the category of D modules or constructible sheaves or whatever you want to work with on the Hecke stack, understood as a in the derived sense is not the derived category that's hard. So that's actually a good example of a category that does not arise as the derived category of the abelian category. Yeah, so it's actually not really the kind of thing. Like for me, I would prefer to kind of do most constructions in a homotopy invariant way from the beginning, and then sort of all of your functors will be exact by construction. But I'm trying to give derived functors as an example because those are sort of more familiar from classical mathematics, right? Yeah. In that case, you can upgrade derived Satake from a functor from derived category of representations of the dual group to the sort of full, triangulated or DG category of D modules on the Hecke stack. But you kind of have to do that. I just want to say this. Again, the target is not the derived category that's fine. So it's a little bit, doesn't quite fit into that paragraph that I was saying. Okay, any other questions about this? So, one thing you could reasonably ask is well, if everything is exact, I'm used to thinking about left exact functors and right exact functors, and in homological algebra, these first behave differently, right? If I start with some object in an abelian category and I apply a right derived functor to it, I'll typically get some complex, right, that maybe goes off into positive homological degrees in general, right? So how do I distinguish between that situation and something that's the derived functor of an exact functor, right, where I won't have this kind of behavior? And so that's where the theory of T structures comes in. So there's a T structure on the stable category. And it's exactly the same as in the context of triangulated categories. So it's the same datum as the T structure on the homotopy category C, which is some triangulated category. So this Brian, this one, familiar with this or haven't thought about it in a while. The T structure, it's that of some full subcategories. Satisfying some conditions. Maybe I don't want to go into definition, but what you're supposed to think of is if C is like some kind of category of complexes. These are, I'm putting homological vanishing conditions on, right? So I have the connective complexes and the co-connective complexes, right? There's a particular Hom vanishing. I can't have Homs, I don't have non-zero Homs from connected things to strictly co-connected things because there's no sort of arrows that, yeah, just again, axiomatizing this pattern we see with complexes. And in this situation, we in particular get an abelian category. So this is called the heart of the T structure. The intersection of the connective and co-connective objects, so things, so to speak, concentrated in homological degree 0. This is the heart. Definition. It's an abelian category. And we also have some associated, again, from these axioms, we get some associated homology functors. So these are some functors that allow us to pass from an object of C to an object in the heart of C. And these have the feature that if I start with an exact triangle in C, I get a long exact sequence on these homologies. So I'll get a long exact sequence in. So this is kind of the axiomatic pattern that allows you to generalize along exact sequences and so on. Now, we can also talk about left T exact and right T exact functors. So F is right T exact. This means that F preserves connective objects, right? So if I have two stable categories with T structures, being right T exact means it sends connective objects to connective objects, left T exact means it sends co-connective objects to co-connective objects, T exact means both. And this is the thing that generalizes exact, right exactness, left exactness for functors between abelian categories. So if I start with some functor on abelian categories, let's say it's left exact, and I take its right derived functor, that functor will be left T exact. So it's exact in the categorical sense, but it's left T exact, and that reflects the fact that the original functor was left exact in the abelian level. So a left T exact functor, if something is in positive homological degrees, it'll stay there, but it could kind of spread out to the right? Pick up new homology groups, higher homology groups. This may seem like very abstract, right? It's like, why? Well, sometimes you construct T structures in a non-trivial way, right? So we have the whole theory of perverse sheaves is like the archetypical example of this, where we start with some complexes of constructible sheaves, or constructible complexes, whatever. These have some natural T structure just by virtue of being complexes, but we don't actually use this sort of obvious T structure. We use some non-obvious subcategories. Okay, so this is how we define perverse sheaves. Some surprising choice, okay, of connective and co-connective objects. But then we can apply this whole theory abstractly. This is the innovation of the BBD paper, right? And this theory of perverse sheaves falls out. So, yeah. So really, like the proper context for homological algebra is the stable category of the T structure. It's typically the kind of data that you want to do homological algebra.
In these notations, when you have a T exact functor, which has a left that joins, Left adjoint is left or right exact.
Yeah, it's the same kind of rule as for abelian categories. So if I have a functor which is, let me think about this, a functor which is left t exact and it has a left adjoint, the left adjoint will be right t exact. Right, this
Left.
so right t exactness for a left adjoint corresponds to left t exactness for the right adjoint. Just like for abelian categories, right? Left exactness for the left adjoint corresponds, or sorry, right exactness for the left adjoint corresponds to left exactness for the right adjoint. Just think about like tensor product is right exact, inner hom is left exact.
Yeah.
Right. It's the example to keep in mind to remember those. So, but here, like everything is exact in this sense. So it's the corresponding factor for t exactness.
Because for functors, right, left adjoint is left exact. Like, left adjoint of an exact functor is left exact.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. It's the same kind of.
No, but there it slopes.
No,
It's left right and here is left adjoint is left.
The left adjoint, if the left adjoint is right exact, the right adjoint is left exact and left t exact. Then
No, I mean not C, but like just in these terms. I think it's
it's the same patterns for the categories. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, so I want to talk about co-complete stable categories. I'd like to wrap up the general nonsense maybe at the break and then start talking about sheaves. So co-complete stable categories are sort of the final stepping stone before we get to DG categories. They're co-complete stable categories with co-limit preserving functors. And notice that this co-limit preserving for functors between stable categories implies exact, right? Because in particular, they preserve finite co-limits, so they're right exact, so they're exact. Okay. This co-limit preserving condition, there's a few different ways to say it, so let me just kind of state this as a quick little proposition here. Again, give you an exercise if you want to think about these things. So C and D are co-complete stable. And F is an exact functor, then the following are equivalent. One is F preserves filtered colimits. This is sometimes called continuity. Correct. General definition of continuity is preserving filtered colimits. Condition 2, and filtered colimit, by the way, it means the same thing as an ordinary category here. Like filtered and ordinary category is the diagram. Condition 2 is that F preserves all colimits. The condition that appeared there. Third condition is that F preserves Rex. Okay, so maybe I wrote them in a weird order. This one, it sort of looks maybe like the weakest condition or something, but in fact it implies the others. So for exact functors, this colimit preserving conditions, this means that you preserve all direct sums, including infinite direct sums. So it's actually a pretty mild condition. Most kind of nice functors that arise in practice have this property. The kind of thing that would be something involving like a limit of an infinite inverse limit or something like that, right? Like a completion or something like that. Those are the kind of things that don't. We usually spot those and be careful when we see them.
So preserving finite colimits implies you preserve finite limits, but preserving some colimits.
No, it doesn't mean it's completely different from like preserving all direct sums is very different from preserving finite. That's right. Okay, So yeah, so this is sort of the context that again we'll sort of build DG categories in. So now there's a point where I'm going to have to just be very, very loose because I have absolutely no time to give all the relevant definitions. So I'll refer you to Rosenblum, but I think this is the kind of thing where you can absolutely just use your intuition from ordinary category theory and take on faith the following things work. So you can define the following notions. So symmetric monoidal categories. In the higher categorical sense. So these are, if you like, another way of saying it is, these are the same thing as monoids or commutative monoids in categories. So there's some general notion of a monoid in an infinity category. I guess what you need as products or something like that. General notion of a monoid is this kind of Siegel type yoga. Again, it's for Rosenblum for these definitions. I think they explained it pretty well in that chapter 1. Okay. By the way, it seems complicated the first time you see it, but I think it's actually much more elegant than the traditional definition of monoidal and symmetric monoidal categories in ordinary category theory. So a great exercise is to look at their definition or the Lurie definition of, for example, a monoidal category, apply it in the 2 category of ordinary categories, and see that you actually get the classic definition of monoidal category from McLean or whatever it was first written down. And again, especially when you start talking about symmetric monoidal categories, the axioms are quite complicated, right? And I think this definition is actually much simpler. But it's, again, you just have to say something about 2 categories, but it's quite clean. So we have this notion, and if A is a symmetric monoidal category, then we can talk about commutative or associative algebras in A. Just like an ordinary category theory. So in order to talk about commutative algebras, I need it to be symmetric monoidal. In a general monoidal category, I can just talk about associative algebras. And then if A is an associative algebra, which, like, as you would expect, any commutative algebra in particular can be viewed as an associative algebra. So this would also include that situation. We can talk about A modules in A, or more generally, any category that's sort of acted on by A. Notion of monoidal category with an action on some module category. Sort of fit into this framework is just it's notion of action of a monoid on some object. Okay. So I guess I should say like left. It's associative, and you talk about left A modules, it's commutative, there's no difference, right? Okay.
There's a question from Zoom.
Yes.
Why do functors preserving co-limits imply preserving limits?
They don't. That was the question. Finite? Finite colimits or?
Yes, finite.
Did they just say with no? If there's no qualification, then it's false. It's the same question you just asked.
No, I mean, in the previous board, you wrote something like,
Not all functors. Preserving colimits is
yeah, co-continuous, or I don't know, preserving colimit implies exact, something like that.
We cannot hear you if you're speaking. I don't know if it's...
I was saying in the previous board, you say something like implies exact, right? Just
well, if they rephrase the question. Yeah. Okay. But I think I addressed it. It's false. And to be clear, like preserving colimits is, you should think of as being like a much kind of milder and more common condition of preserving limits. I mean, there are plenty of functions to preserve limits too, but kind of, I would say preserving colimits is being nice, preserving limits is something special.
Sorry, are you capable of, are you able
yeah.
to hear us when we speak or no?
Rosenblum, if you want to see these definitions, I think they're actually quite elegant. And again, you can apply them in ordinary category theory in sort of a two categorical sense and really see where these things like, for example, in symmetric monodal categories, you have this horrible hexagon axiom and stuff. You can actually see it falling out from there. Okay, so a key property of co-complete stable categories is that it admits symmetric monoidal structure. So there's a way to tensor co-complete stable categories. It's called Lurie tensor product. I think this terminology was introduced by Gates Corey. Obviously, Lurie didn't call it that. And it has the following kind of characterization, which is that, say it this way, so colimit preserving functors from the tensor product into some other co-complete stable category are the same thing as functors on the product, which preserve colimits in each variable separate. In other words, for any object in C, right, I get an induced functor from D to E, and that functor preserves colimits. That condition holds as I vary over all objects of C, and likewise for all objects of D. Okay, so functors, colimit preserving functors from this tensor product to some other co-complete stable category are a full subcategory inside of functors of this form, satisfying this condition. So that gives you actually, you know, a real characterization of what this tensor product is, and so its existence is then like a statement. Yeah.
Yeah, well, when you mentioned formalism category, it was with respect to this monodal structure or just with product?
I was talking about with respect to product, and now this is a symmetric monodal structure on this category with respect to product.
Okay, they have a monoid in this category with this symmetric monodal structure.
Now I'm saying consider this as an object of this all infinity one categories. It's a symmetric monodal category as such.
Okay, but then inside.
And then inside of there, we can talk about community relationships, which will be like symmetric monodal categories with colimits preserving, which preserve colimits in each variable. So this is quite a fantastic innovation, and I think really makes this theory much easier to work with than maybe some previously existing alternatives. The unit for this symmetric monodal structure is so-called category of spectra. This is the like, well, saying that it's the unit of the symmetric monodal structure already characterizes it. In fact, that's a kind of a crazy way to define spectra, but you could. Maybe a more concrete way to say it is that it's stabilization. It's sort of the universal stable thing attached to point in spaces, point improvements. So I think I said this during a question last time or something. I actually said it during a question talk, but anytime I have kind of a category with a zero object, I can consider, you know, finite limits or something. I can consider this kind of tower, right, where I just taking successive loops functors, take the limit of that tower. And that's going to be kind of the universal stable thing attached to the category. So if I apply this to pointed groupoids, I get this category spectrum. And this is the unit for this blurry tensor. Okay. This is a complicated category, so it's, I mean, it's very, very, for example, it contains, you know, all the information of like the homotopic groups of spheres and so on, or stable homotopic groups of spheres and so on. Very complicated category. But one way to kind of understand it is that it has a T structure. And the heart is just the abelian category of abelian groups. So in particular, we have these cohomology functors. So to any spectrum, I can attach a sequence of abelian groups. Now, traditionally, these are written ii because they're sort of more akin to homotopy groups. But they're literally the cohomology functors for this T structure. And so you have long exact sequences and so on and so forth. So you can almost think of this, it's some like much more complicated, much richer sort of version of like complexes of abelian groups, right? Because again, you have like sort of homology groups in all degrees, but sort of the way that they're glued to one another is much, much more complicated than category of groups, complexes of abelian groups. This is not really going to play a super important role in what follows, but I think it's just worth mentioning, and maybe the way I think set things up, I can say this at some point. Try to define BG categories and then we'll stop. Right.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So what are some, I guess, what are some examples of like associative algebras in cat stable?
Oh, the associative algebras?
Yeah.
Any monoidal category where the tensor product preserves colimits in each variable. That is what a associative algebra there is. So it's this like, if I have a monoidal category, right, I have a particular monoidal product from like C times C to C, and saying that kind of extends to be defined on the Larry tensor product is saying that it preserves colimits in each variable set. Which again, very, very typical kind of property for a monoidal structure to have, right? Like think about tensor product. Right? Always preserves direct sums of the variables.
Can't do this in like ordinary categories.
No, you can. I mean, I think this all probably so there, you know, again, you would have to say everything kind of in two categorical language because ordinary categories are, you know, form a two category, but you could formulate something like this. And I don't know how useful it would be because again, like here, this kind of it has homological algebra like encoded into it automatically, and there you would have to also worry about deriving things, but you know, you could make sense of this. And I mean, yeah, it's not the stable part is not so important here. Like if I don't say the stable thing, then I still have a kind of blurry tensor product on the entire ambient world of all co-complete categories. There, the monoidal unit is pointed spaces, or maybe just spaces, and but it's sort of like co-complete stable categories are sort of like a non-unital sort of sub-monoidal category of that, and the unit inside the smaller category is this category spectrum. So yeah. Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought of, I'm sure some people have thought about this kind of thing in ordinary category theory, but yeah, again, you could try to kind of embed that into the world and see what happens.
This number question is cat ST complete stable.
Yeah, oh, is it a stable category? It's related to this like problem of, you know, if you try to work with DG categories in some strict sense, right? Like literally enriched in complexes of vector spaces, the way that, like, you know, for example, these Trenfeld and paper by Keller and so on. That does not itself form a DG category. And it's like very kind of similar, you know. Well, here, yeah, because stable categories are not do not themselves form a stable category. Like fiber product and push out are just in completely different operations that are not related to one another. All right, so DG categories. Let me just finish up here. So as I said, inside of all spectra, I have this very sort of concrete subcategory, which is just the abelian category of abelian groups. These are what are called sometimes discrete spectra. And this inclusion it's a full subcategory. It's not quite symmetric monoidal, basically because, like, I mean, if I said the same thing for complexes of abelian groups, it would also not be symmetric monoidal because, like, there would, on the right hand side, I'm taking derived tensor product, and here I'm taking just non-derived tensor product, right? But it is lap symmetric monoidal. So in particular, like, it preserves commutative algebras. So if I have a discrete, meaning like just ordinary commutative ring, I can view it as a commutative algebra inside ordinary abelian groups, and that means I can view it as a commutative algebra in spectra. And so I'm going to define a mod, okay, derive modules over commutative ring. Parentheses should be there. To be a modules in spectra. Which, if that seems kind of bizarre that this should involve spectra, you could also think about it. You could first do this for Z, right? And then sort of think of A as a commutative algebra in Z modules, and it's also, this is also true. So, but at some point, you know, I have to start somewhere, and so it's spectra is kind of the ambient symmetric mode category in this area.
Entering with K would give you K linear category.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where I'm going with this.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe just one more quick remark. I had an email exchange with Aaron about this the other day. So this, by the way, gives you an intrinsic construction of the category of derived category of abelian groups or A modules more generally. Completely intrinsic higher categorical construction, right? Notice there's no differentials, you know, there's no chains or anything like that. But I claim, like, this really, its homotopy category, it really is the derived category of A modules. Okay. So you see, like, complexes really do arise naturally in this higher categorical setting. So this is a completely intrinsic construction. Okay. So in particular, if I take A equals K to be a field, then define vex K, you know, vex K is K modules, and in fact, this is equivalent to, as an infinity category, it's equivalent to the sort of strict thing that I wrote earlier. Notice this definition looks different though, right? And sort of starting from a different place. This is sort of more intrinsic. This is some kind of more explicit, you know, you have to use some model of infinity categories there. View it as a simplicial category or something, take the nerve, whereas here it's totally intrinsic. They do in fact produce the same result. Okay, and the last thing is the definition of DG categories. So DG categories are supposed to be sort of like co-complete stable categories that are enriched in vector spaces. So the HOMs are supposed to be really complexes of vector spaces as opposed to just ergoids or sets or whatever. This turns out to be kind of awkward to say directly, like what does it mean to be enriched? It's like a little bit, just the kind of higher algebra is a bit complicated. So it turns out to just be easier to say as follows. So first of all, vect is itself a commutative algebra object in co-complete stable categories. I mean, I could say the same for any commutative ring. There's tensor product over K, and that functor preserves direct sums, preserves all colimits in both variables. Again, this is some higher categorical construction I'm sweeping under the rug, but it makes sense whenever I have models over a commutative algebra and I have all colimits around, I can form tensor products relatively, right? And so the definition of PG categories over K then is, again, instead of saying enriched, I talk about action of vector spaces. I say tensored over vector spaces. So this is the definition of PGCat. It comes with a forgetful functor to co-complete stable categories. In fact, this preserves all limits and colimits. So all the stuff we've been saying about limits and colimits of categories just translates very neatly over there. It's just carry along the action of vector spaces for the. So again, the way this looks is I'm saying a DG category is something that's tensored over complex of vector spaces. So for any object and any complex of vector spaces, I can tensor them to obtain a new object. Why does this entail, how do I get the kind of enrichment? How do I get the complexes of Palms? Well, it's basically just adjoint functor theorem, right? So if I have a DG category C, that's the last thing I'll say, and we'll stop with a break. If I have a DG category C, and I have C1 and C2 objects in C, okay, then let me just make sure I get the variance right here. I can define a functor from X to C, which is just tensoring with C1. This is the kind of structure that a DG category has, right? And this preserves colimits for completely formal reasons. We have set things up. And so by the adjoint functor theorem, it has a right adjoint. On from C1, second input unspecified. Okay. So in particular, for any two objects, C1 and C2, I get a complex of vector spaces. And it really does enrich the space of the groupoid of Homs. So if I apply the sort of Dold-Kahn construction, right, to extract this a groupoid or a space from this complex, I recover the Hom in the underlying category. Something. Okay. So yeah, moral of the story is it's much easier to kind of say tensored over vector spaces than it is to say enriched in vector spaces. And so since we're kind of working in this co-complete setting, we can just set things up this way and it works. Yeah.
I wouldn't use this notation because sometimes it helps the internal form as an object of the case.
Yeah, I mean,
Actually,
yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, I could write like underline Hom vector or something, but C doesn't have a tensor structure, doesn't have a tensor product here, so I don't think there's any way to get confused in this. But yeah, you're right in general.
I think the code usually ignores just form, and the space it knows map.
It denotes maps, but I would kind of disagree with that in some situations because, like, let's say I have abelian complexes of abelian groups or something like there's the Homs of like homomorphisms of abelian groups, and then there's the maps of kind of the underlying groupoids or something. Like if I'm talking about group objects in some category, there's a difference. So anyway, yeah, different dimensions, but duly noted. Okay, I'll stop there for the break.
So let's resume at 5:04.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about derived categories of sheaves. That was the original title for the talk. So yeah, I don't think we'll kind of get the full payoff of all this higher categorical stuff in this talk. That's really going to come later when we get more seriously into derived categories of sheaves on stacks, where it seems much more essential. But I can still kind of speak in this language. So let me write. Use the symbol for the category of schemes of finite type over my base field K. So I want to talk about what is like a theory of sheaves. What is like the six-functor formalism. So it's going to be something like the following. So there's several pieces of data, but like as a starting point, we could ask for a functor. And I'm going to be kind of loose because I'll allow kind of several different sheaf theory contexts to fall within this general pattern. But it would look something like functor from schemes of finite type. Let me start with kind of the inverse image functor. So this will be contravariant to DG categories. And I have some coefficient field E. So E will just be some other field. Probably you always in practice assume the characteristic of E is 0, right? It's like, I mean, for example, if you want to, take traces on homology groups or something, you probably want to set characteristic 0. And all examples and stuff. Well, okay, and this would be the kind of thing that okay, I'll say what it does on objects in a second, because again, there are several different examples I want to encompass here, but I'll just say quickly, the reason it's contravariant is because I am thinking about the inverse image functor, right, as the functor reality. Okay, so in an ideal world, you would have such a functor, and it would really be a functor of infinity link categories. And this is like saying in particular, it's compatible with compositions up to coherent homotopy. Maybe more to the point, it's saying, whereas normally I would think about these as triangulated categories, they have some enhancements that are actually DG categories, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of like your ideal setup if you want to have a nice sheaf theory. So let me give some examples. This type of situation.
Just notation advice. B means BC.
Bounded and constructible or something like that. I'll give specific examples.
Because bounded.
Yeah, I'll talk about kind of unbounded. Here it's like, oh, actually, yeah, this is actually a really good point. So these are not quite living in the world of DB categories that I said before. These are sort of not co-complete. Yeah, they're kind of small. So like, I didn't really define it, but you can define kind of non-co-complete categories in a similar way. They'll just be, not necessarily co-complete, and they'll be tensored kind of over finite dimensional vector spaces, right? So didn't have time to get into it. Yeah, small DG categories, but in particular, I don't require them to have full limits, and I don't require the functors to preserve full limits. They're just going to be exact functors.
So yeah, that was my question. I think you just had it. Is DBC actually co-complete?
No, it won't be co-complete. Yeah, sorry. So that's why I had that correction. Thanks. Okay, so examples here would be, so probably the simplest and most classical setting is what you might call the Betty setting. So here, K and E are both the complex numbers. And this EBC of X is the sort of bounded constructible derived category. And here again, I mean it in kind of like a categorical sense, so it's not really a triangulated derived category, but it's enhancement that you construct somehow. Certainly this is done of sheaves of complex vector spaces on the C points of X in the sort of analytic topology. Right, this is the kind of thing that people consider classically. This is some slightly fancy version where I consider infinity category, but it's not so important. Another setting would be the elatic setting. So here, probably I always want to assume that the ground field is algebraically closed, but not super important, but I'll just say that for simplicity. And then here, E would be like QL bar, where L is not equal to the characteristic of K. So this is the only example where we kind of allow K to have a positive characteristic. And then here, ABC of X would be bounded, constructible derived category of a towel UL bar sheaves. This variety. That's another kind of situation that we might consider. And then finally, the one that's going to be most relevant for us is the so-called random situation. So in order for it to fit into this paradigm that I'm discussing now, well, okay, first of all, in this situation, the coefficient field is the same as the ground field. And here, again, to be in this kind of non-co-complete setting where I have a six-functor formalism, this would actually have to be the bounded derived category of D modules with holonomic cohomology sheaves. This is really kind of the correct analog of these things. If I consider all D modules, which I will discuss momentarily, I get something that behaves quite different. Okay. So this is more closely analogous to these classic situations. Okay, so these are the three basic settings I want you to kind of keep in mind. And in all of these situations, F upper star has a right adjoint. F lower star. Okay, so we have F upper star and F lower star for all maps F. Another piece of structure here is the Verdier duality. So there's a contravariant self-equivalence. Of Verdier duality in all these situations. It's even, yeah, so I didn't say, but all of these have, all these categories have T structures. So let me just say. All these categories have T structures. So here, I consider reverse T structure in these two examples and the kind of naive T structure here. So those would be really the most closely analogous ones. So importantly, Verdier duality is T exact for reverse T structure. It's not T exact for like more naive T structure. Reason to use this. And then more things. We have some operation whereby if I have complex of X and a complex of Y, I can attach to it complex of X times Y. Box times external direct product, or external product, I guess you can call it. There's a tensor structure, right? Which is like you do delta upper star of the external tensor product. So this defines a symmetric modal structure. And then lastly, we have the so-called exceptional inverse image. Okay, which is one way to define it, I guess, would be conjugating the ordinary inverse image by Verdier duality. And then likewise for direct image with convex supports. Okay, and because the Verdier duality is contravariant, F lower streak is left adjoint. To F upper streak. Reverses the order of the adjunction. So this is like all the structure that's kind of floating around. So these like inner columns again. Sorry.
Shouldn't there also be a natural transformation from the floor sheaf to a floor stack?
Yes. Yeah. I'll say it. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. There's a few other things. So. Yeah, I guess if you define things in this way, that's highly obvious. But yeah, it's true. So yeah, that was actually the next thing on my notes. So there exists canonical natural transformation. Floater sheaf to floater star. It's an isomorphism if F is proper. Maybe that's even an if only if statement, I can't remember. You know, there's various other things I can say. I guess I'll just kind of I'll go through the laundry list. So this is kind of a cheat sheet for 6-functor. So if F is smooth of relative dimension D, then F upper streak is isomorphic to F upper star up to a shift. So this is somehow related to classical point duality.
So it could be pedantic, but D is really idempotent. What do you mean? Maybe either D is idempotent, or you should have written.
It's idempotent. Yeah, absolutely.
D versus these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very, very. Thanks. So another important property is base change. So this is kind of like maybe the most like fundamental computational tool we have, right? In working with derived categories of sheaves. So let's say I have two maps F and G like this, and I take a fiber product, you call the base change as F prime and G prime. So then I get isomorphisms of functors like so. So if I, for example, do direct image with compact supports followed by inverse image, that's the same as doing inverse image followed by direct image with compact supports along the other circuit. Very dually, you have the same statement for upper streak, lower star. But you know, crucial here, you only have base change for kind of streak against star. Right? If I had both stars here or both streaks, this would be totally false in general. And lastly, I just want to make a remark that this encapsulates kind of classical theory of homology of various kinds, right? It's sort of built into this. So if I write P for the map from structure map from X to spec K for some scheme X, let me write E sub X for P upper star of the, you know, it depends on which situation I'm in, but it's like the constant thing with value E, right, on a point. And then likewise, omega sub X will denote P upper streak E. So these are the so-called constant and canonical sheaves, respectively. Canonical complexes in general. If P is smooth, these will be the same up to a shift, but in general, they could be kind of complicated. Especially thinking about things in perverse structure. And then, you know, we have these various flavors of homology theory that kind of right? So the sort of ordinary, so I write C instead of H just because I want to stay at the level of complexes. So I mean like chains. Right, wrote H would mean maybe taking homology groups, but you can think about this as H. It's a difference. So this is like P lower star of the constant sheaf. So if you like, this is P lower star, P upper star of E. The homology would be the same thing, but with streaks. Right, and then you have the kind of other variants where I mix streaks and stars. You have homology to compact supports, right? Which is P lower streak constant. So that's P lower streak of P upper star. E. And then finally, there's the most kind of exotic one, which is the Grell-Moore homology. So this is P lower star of dualizing, P lower star of P upper Shrika. We have all these various homology theories in these settings. Okay. So
one more question.
Yeah.
So there's base change properties here.
Uh-huh.
I'm usually used to think that there's base change with respect to morphisms that define some property. Just like proper base change for hidden sheaves, etc.
Right.
If you're saying it's like
it's just true.
no conditions.
Yeah, I mean, often when with those kinds of statements, like proper base change, so there's kind of two reasons you might impose hypotheses. One is because you want some statement to hold at the abelian level. If you impose some blackness or something like that. The other one is because you want lower sheaf to equal lower star, which is why you would ask for
Change some response.
Yeah, but this is true until the join. But like if F is proper, for example, then I'll have base change of F lower star against G upper star because F lower star equals F lower star. But this is the statement that's true unconditional. Yeah. So yeah, all of these homology theories can be extracted from these from the sheaf theory. So for in the Betty situation, I'm getting singular homology and cohomology. In the L-adic setting, obviously L-adic homology and cohomology. In the Durham setting, Durham homology cohomology. It's all built in. Okay. And just as kind of an afterthought here, if I want to define all of this in sort of a co-complete situation, I can do it. And this is something where I realize now I just completely skipped a section of my talk, but I think it was necessary. So there's an operation called incompletion, which is where I sort of freely adjoin filtered colimits. So for any sort of small DG category, I can build a co-complete DG category out of it in a universal way. It's just by kind of universally adjoining direct sums essentially. And in this situation, again, these are words that I haven't defined, but maybe Carol can talk about them next week. This is going to be exactly the compact generators for this large co-complete category. So I'll have this small category sitting inside. These will be exactly the compact generators for this large category, just kind of by construction, just defined it that way. Okay. And I think that's sort of the proper way to define large categories of complex sheets in these kinds of situations. So in all these situations, I can do this. All of my functors sort of like preserve BBC. So just by extending in the kind of, there's a unique way to extend such that they all preserve direct sums, and I'll get functors on the co-complete categories as well. All of these things will follow formally in that situation. But in some situations, you may want to consider infinite direct sums of proper sheaves and things like that. So this situation where you'd have to work. All right. Any questions about all of that? Okay, great. So last thing I wanted to talk about is D-modules and really allowing all D-modules and not just polynomials will look quite different. Yeah, I completely skipped the section on compact generation. Again, it'll have to be put off to next week. There's not too much to say there, so hopefully people can take it on faith for now. Say a few things. Okay, so D-modules here. I'm just going to assume characteristic 0. And so I'm going to write D of X for the unbounded derived category D-modules. Scheme of finite X. I don't start with this bounded thing and then incomplete. Right? I just take full unbounded derived category for reasons which will shortly become apparent. So this has functoriality. Let's say first what the contravariant functoriality is. So this could be upgraded to contravariant functor on all schemes of finite type. And it's going to send homomorphism of schemes to what could really be called F upper shrink. Somehow the natural inverse image on D modules is really the exceptional inverse. So it's what G-lim called LF upper star, because that's what it corresponds to in quasi-coherent sheaves. But in the D module world, it really plays the analogous role to F upper shrink in the reasons that again wasn't clear.
Correct. Now you say that like D modules are like quasi-coherent, and there was like the relation between incoherent, like incompletion of regular holonomic and all D modules is the same as incoherent sheaf quasi.
The incompletion of like holonomic D modules is not at all this. It's much smaller than this.
Yeah, but is it related, like does it behave the same as like incoherent and quasi?
No, I would say it's sort of a like okay, so I talked about these flavors of kind of constructible type sheaves, and then we have D modules, and then there's also, of course, like incoherent and quasi-coherent sheaves. And I would say D modules looks almost like some kind of hybrid between the sort of constructible setting and the quasi-coherent setting. So it sort of looks, it has features of both. And in particular, interacts directly with incoherent and quasi-coherent sheaves. So if I have a D module, I can extract the quasi-coherent sheaf from it. I can also extract the incoherent sheaf from it, and these interact in various ways. That's the crystal picture, which I definitely need to talk about. But
why did you mention the conditional formalism in the discussion?
just because again, I need it in order to have like F lower shrink and F upper star. Otherwise, those functors won't. So I'll talk about this in a second, because in this situation we won't have this. So what we do have, we have F upper shrink, and then we also have covariant version, the covariant functoriality. Where if I have homomorphism schemes, there's a Durand push for it here. This is always defined. And this is what G-lim called, I think, integral this functor. Okay, so crucially here, F upper shriek, I mean, as the notation suggests, these are not adjoint. Instead, you'll just have the kind of relations that I wrote up here. So for example, if if F is proper, then F lower star would be left adjoint to F upper shriek. If it's smooth, they'll be adjoint on the other side up to the shift and so on. But I don't have any adjunction between these in general, which is the reason why I call it F upper shriek and not F upper star, right? F upper star should always be left adjoint. It's really not that. It's the thing that plays the role of exception. Now, we should do an account. Things here, so we do have the Faraday duality setting. So oh, sorry, let me just say, one other thing, which is that this category is always compactly generated. So it's going to be compactly generated by the bounded derived category of coherent. So coherent meaning finally generated over D, right? Over like as a D module. So crucially, this is a much weaker condition than being holonomic. So this category is much larger. And it includes things, for example, like differential operators itself is coherent, but not holonomic. Okay, so this is going to be very important for what I'm going to say in a moment. So we have the Faraday duality. So like in the like in that other situation, it's going to be a contravariant equivalence on coherent boundary complexes of coherent D modules. Boundary complexes of coherent homologies is probably a better way to say it. Okay. But now here's the kicker. So you'd really like to talk about, F upper shrink and F lower shrink and F upper star. But I claim that these functors just don't exist in general. So F upper shrink and F lower star do not admit left adjoints. So instead, what you should think is that these functors are kind of partially defined. Right, because even if an adjoint functor doesn't exist as a functor, it may have well-defined values on some objects, right? Because an adjoint functor, the value of an adjoint functor on some object, by definition, it represents or co-represents some functor. And so the value is uniquely determined. It's just a yes or no question of whether it exists, right? And so in particular, these left adjoints, they are always defined on polynomic objects, which is what I was using before, but in general, they are not. Fine. So this is related to the fact that these functors do not preserve common elements. So again, this is something where maybe you all can discuss this type of phenomenon more next week because I don't really have time. But imagine if these functors did preserve compact objects, then I could just sort of define F lower shrink and F upper star by the same formula as I did earlier, just by conjugating by Verdier duality, right? But Verdier duality is really only defined on coherent complexes. And so if these don't actually send coherent complexes to coherent complexes, and that sort of formula doesn't make sense, right? So it's basically for the same reason. Yeah.
Is it true that polynomicity is a necessary and sufficient condition for this partially defined adjoints to exist?
Probably not. They probably, yeah.
Sufficient but not necessary.
Yeah, sufficient but not necessary. Yeah, I think they're so. For example, yeah, definitely not in general because, for example, like if F is proper, then F lower shrink just equals F lower star, and it's defined on all objects. So yeah, it's sufficient but not necessary. Okay, so let me kind of, yeah, maybe a good place to kind of wrap up would be to explain why do these functors not preserve compact objects, which, like I said, the same thing as coherence. This is kind of a nice concrete calculation I can do to demonstrate again what's really different about D modules versus these kind of more these constructible type sheets that I was saying. So let me get two examples. Example one is, say X is smooth for simplicity, and let's let lowercase x be a K point. So I'm going to take the Schritt inverse image, which would be like it's like Schritt fiber at X of the sheaf differential operators itself. And I claim, okay, maybe there's a shift here. I'll ignore it because it kind of depends on how you define D, but I go left or whatever. But up the shift, this is formal distributions on X supported at the point X. So this has some intrinsic definition, but another way to express it would be continuous linear functionals on the completed local ring of X. I can consider this kind of thing, right? Okay. So again, this is a true formula in general. Great exercise to try to like prove this yourself. And the thing I want to point out is that this is infinite dimensional. So in particular, it's not coherent in D modules on a point, which is just that. So coherent demodules need not have finite-dimensional fibers, basically what I'm saying. So that tells us that f upper sheaf doesn't have to preserve compactness, doesn't have to preserve coherence. So let me give an example for f lower star. So again, well here, I'm going to take this kind of map P, projection to point structure map. And the example I want to give in this case, again, I'm going to be applying P lower star to something that's not polynomic, but only coherent necessarily. And so P lower star, again, of the sheaf of differential operators, again, if you kind of work through the definitions, you'll see that this is exactly R gamma. It's exactly the global sections of the structure sheaf in the quasi-coherent world. Okay. And so in particular, this, of course, it may be finite dimensional. Typically that would happen exactly when X is proper, right? But otherwise it won't be finite dimensional. And you can say more generally, if I take some quasi-coherent sheaf on X, I tensor it up with differential operators, right, to make it a D-module, and then take the Durand global sections, I get the quasi-coherent global sections of the original, like R gamma in the sense of Hartshorne or whatever. And so, yeah, so sort of because this theory contains the theory of global sections of quasi-coherent sheaves, it's something that very much does not preserve compact objects in this case. Okay. All right, so I guess we'll just pause questions. Finally said something kind of concrete here. So we see that this theory really has a very different flavor from like constructible sheaves. Like I said, it feels like some kind of hybrid between quasi-coherent sheaves and yeah, since I have a bit of time left, maybe I'll make the following kind of general comment. So in this world of co-complete stable categories, we have the notion of dualizing, or maybe I should say teaching paths. Like working in that context, have notion of dualizability with respect to Lurie tensor product. And by the way, when I say Lurie tensor product in DG categories, I always mean like the tensor product of the vector modules versus commutative algebra, so I take tensor product. Okay, dualizability is something that makes sense in any monoidal category. Symmetric monoidals, we don't have to worry about that versus. Great, so it's something like I have, evaluation and co-evaluation. Satisfy some unit to quick relations. And by the way, you can impose, this may sound kind of scary because I'm talking about higher category, but you can actually just impose these unit co-unit relations in the homotopy category. And it doesn't actually affect the notion of dualizability. So this is actually one case where it's like the higher category theory doesn't really add any complexity. You could just talk about dualizability in the underlying, in the homotopy category, and you get the correct solutions. You don't have to worry about higher. So we have this notion of dualizable category. something again, looks very unfamiliar, simply. But there's a very important case where dualizability is guaranteed, which is for a category that's compactly generated. So if C is compactly generated by, say, some subcategory C naught, then it's automatically dualizable, and the dual is given by the formula in completion of the opposite category. This is really an exercise from the definitions. Basically, the pairing, you mainly just have to say what the evaluation pairing is. The evaluation pairing is exactly given by the Hom pairing between C naught and C naught off, and then just extends in the only way you can compatible with direct sums.
So in the case of PX, what is?
Yeah, good point. So we have the Verdier duality. Which is the contravariant self-equivalence on coherent complexes, and now just end extend, and we get a identification between dx and its inclusion. So this is the real kind of, this is the correct interpretation of Verdier duality in the co-complete set. So rather than being contravariant, it's a covariant equivalence, but the one side is actually the dual category. Okay. So another way to think about this, I can even kind of say explicitly what pairing realizes this duality, which will, in the process, will specify what Verdier duality is exactly. Yeah, I think it's good that I think that's exactly the kind of thing that is not going to work so smoothly for things like fun. So, trivial. Not all of this is not trivial as well, right? Just summarizing a bunch of concepts. So, yeah, but I want to say this equivalence is given by the following pairing. So it's going to be a pairing on d of x times d of x with values in vector spaces. And yeah, maybe I should also say, whenever the dual exists, it follows automatically that it's equivalent to functors in the colimit preserving functors from C to X. Sort of like formulated perspective. So so yeah, this pairing is given by the following operation. So first of all, I send F comma G to the external product. Then I restrict to the diagonal. And then I take Derived and both sides. In other words, direct image to a point. Okay, so this pairing, so if you like, this pairing is given by the random global sections of the sheaf tensor product of F and G, which by the way is the natural tensor product of D, right? Because we just had a sheaf of those. So this is the pairing that realizes Verdier duality. And the claim is that, so here actually I told you what the duality datum is, and I claim this actually defines a perfect pairing.
Is before with lower star.
Yeah, lower star. Lower star. Sorry? Sorry. Yeah, it's actually kind of determined, I think. It's so the co-evaluation is going to be, well, let me just say what it is. So this is evaluation, co-evaluation, And I think you can actually extract it normally, let me just say this. So this can actually just be identified. This is actually an equivalence, something I didn't mention before. In the module setting, it's actually an equivalence. That's one of the amazing things about this learned tensor product, because it automatically throws in all colimits. So this kind of looks like it'd be things that are like a box product of two things, but in fact, if you allow all colimits of such, it just generates. So you really do get an equivalence.
What's the feature for trick?
Yeah, it's also very important for getting pairs. So in order to specify the co-evaluation, I just have to specify object on x times x, right? Namely, where does the generator, where does k go? And it's just going to be delta lower star visualized. So this is the duality data. You can do something similar in the construction. Say it. So yeah, that's it. Talk about that. But yeah, one other comment about duality. This actually tells you, you can actually use this to say what the precise relation between f upper streak and f lower star are. They turn out to be exactly under variable duality in this sense. So again, I can't actually write like conjugation by variable duality, but what I can do is draw the following square. So I have some map. Lower star. On the other hand, these categories are self-cool. And I can talk about f upper streak, the dual functor. Okay, and this diagram keys. So this is like the fundamental relationship between f upper streak and f lower star. Again, very good exercise to actually extract from this a concrete statement, which this is not, I realize, but I did tell you what the duality data are, so you can in fact like extract the concrete formula from this and to check that it actually makes sense. Okay. Questions about all this? I'm just gonna give a really quick preview of D modules and stacks, and I'll end there. But any questions at this point? Okay, so really quick preview of D modules and stacks. Carol's going to go into more next week. So let's say I have a prestack. And you typically, I said it would be a contravariant functor, right, from affine schemes to groupoids. I want it to just be defined on finite affine schemes because that's really the setting in which we define D modules. Sorry, takes values in groupoids. So, of course, if I have a prestack defined on all affine schemes, I can restrict it here. And the condition that it's determined by its values here is sort of the condition of being locally affine. So let me just put too much into that, but let's just say we have a prestack of this feature. So what I can do is I can define E modules on it by the following formula. I take the limit over all affine schemes as mapping to X of E of S. So this is the limit under streak pullback, which is the only inverse image we have in general. So one way to say it would be if you think of like prestacks as being kind of generated by affine schemes under the colimits or something like that. This is the right con extension, but it's given by this limit formula explicitly. Okay. This is actually super intuitive if you think about what this limit is. What this is saying is that for every affine scheme S mapping to X, I have a D module on S. And then when I have S mapping to T mapping to X, right, the two possible interpretations of pullbacks to S are given an isomorphism between them, and then I have homotopy covariances. Okay. It's a lot of data. but it's neatly encapsulated by this limited infinity categories. This is really where the formalism, first place I'm using it for this series. Okay, so very, very nice definition. This may seem a little bit scary because, for example, like this looks like a large category that I'm taking a limit over, right? Many such admin schemes mapping in, but this is very, this is not at all economical. There's sort of two ways to resolve this. One is to say, probably when you talk about prestacks, you put some kind of set theoretic condition that ensures that I can make this diagram small. I don't want to think about it. A better thing to say is that, like, in practice, X has some kind of natural system of affine schemes that sort of fill it out. For example, if it's, let me just say this in practice, can use a more economical limit. So if X for example, like if X is an in scheme, right, it's actually a co-limit of a bunch of schemes of finite type under closed embeddings. Okay, so I could write it, the category D modules on X is like the limit of D modules on Xi. Okay, so that's a much more economical presentation. If it's an Artin stack, well, you know, you choose some atlas, and then it's going to be some kind of geometric realization. Choose some atlas, take the Chechner, and that gives me some kind of like simplicial guy, which X is formally going to be the co-limit of that diagram. And then again, I can use that to basically my category D modules will be, you know, I'll have a D module on the total space of the atlas. I'll have a D module on the atlas times the atlas over X, so on and so forth with a bunch of compatibilities. Right? So it's a D module on S together with the distance atlas.
Either condition on the diagram or any presentation will.
Any presentation, yeah. I mean, anytime I write X as a co-limit of something, like this by definition, this is going to send co-limits in this variable to limits here. So it's just always going to work whenever I have. So yeah, in practice, you use more economical presentations of X, not like all affine schemes, but this does make sense. Yeah.
So in that case where you have the presentation, what is the definition of the, or what is the equivalent way to write to that?
Yeah. So these vertical bars, this is like standard notation in higher category theory for the co-limit of a simplicial object. So this is like a simplicial object in prestacks, or I guess probably even in schemes, but let's say prestacks. Well, sorry, let's say X has representable diagram. So then this will actually be a simplicial scheme. Okay, so I get some simplicial object in schemes, and then I can form D modules on each of the objects in that diagram, and then take the
So you're just taking the limit over the diagram that is that.
yeah, exactly. So then in that case, D of X would be the traditional way to write this is tot for totalization. Vertical bars indicate geometric realization, which is what we call the co-limit of a simplicial object, and then totalization is the limit of a co-simplicial object. So this would be totalization of D modules on the sort of Chechner sentence. So this would be the formula. So yeah, much more economical. And this is exactly how you would like think about it in the way that like Bernstein's deal with it, which is like, again, you really want to talk about a D module in the total space of the atlas together with the sent data. And that's exactly what this formula is doing in some sort of slick way. Okay, final comment. If X can be written as a co-limit in this way, not necessarily filtered, like it could be this situation or it could be like this kind of situation, but let's just say it's written as some kind of co-limit. And the inverse image functors. Let's say they all admit left adjoints. Which we would call like Fij lower sheaf, of course. So this would happen, for example, in the in scheme situation, right? Because their F lower star is F lower sheaf. So these functors all have left adjoints because these are all closed embeddings. But for the art and scheme situation, the art and stack situation, this didn't happen. But if this does happen, then it follows that this limit presentation. Okay, so again, this tautologically is the limit of d of xi over the F upper shrieks. But if these admit left adjoints, then by that fact I stated last time, right, about limits versus colimits of categories, since this is a limit over right adjoints, it's equivalent to the colimit over the left adjoints. Where here, this colimit is taken with respect to the F lower shrieks. Okay, so again, this doesn't always happen, but when it does, I can rewrite this definition as a colimit. And this guy is tautologically compactly generated. Okay, if I take some limit of compactly generated categories, there's like no reason whatsoever that needs to be compactly generated. However, if I take a colimit of compactly generated of categories, and the transition functors preserve compact objects, which they do in this case because they're left adjoints, then the resulting colimit category is automatically compactly generated, or immediate from the way that colimits work in this code of people. And so in this situation, we can guarantee that d of x will be compactly generated. So for example, for d modules on an in scheme, automatically compactly generated. But for d modules on an art and stack, because these direct image functors, or sorry, these inverse image functors typically don't have left adjoints in that case, there's no guarantee that d modules on art and stack are compactly generated. We just don't have this kind of presentation. So yeah, the like thing that's really amazing about BunG is that I can write it as a filtered union of not schemes, but quasi-compact open substacks, where the inverse image, the restriction functors all have left adjoints, which is exactly this truncatability condition that Sasha talked about. And d modules on each of these quasi-compact open substacks turns out to be compact generated. So that's what we're next. That's very closely related to this kind of observation.
In the case of BunG on P1, what is the shape of that category? Or just on BunG on P1?
What do you mean? What is the shape like?
I mean, in that case, BunG P1 is pretty simple, right? And if I consider the modules there, will there be a secure description for this?
I mean, again, it's not quasi-compact, right? It looks like this union of like, it's basically, it has a stratification like stacks, but it's an infinite stratification, right? So if I kind of truncate that stratification at some finite degree, finite level, I'll get a quasi-compact stack. And there you can prove that that thing is compactly generated. And then the amazing fact is that shriek extensions are actually defined. There, it's actually obvious. And the reason is because on such a thing that's like, it has a discrete set of k points, and each of the k points is kind of like a classifying stack, basically, right? There, everything is actually polynomial or inpolynomial, right? Because it's like, it has a stratification, and the strata are just classifying stacks. So if I think about like, what are equivariant sheaves on a point? Well, those are definitely polynomial, right? Because when I forget are inpolynomial for sort of trivial reasons. So, so in that case, it's actually sort of clear. But the amazing thing is, like in arbitrary genus, you can actually build a stratification that has the property that the lower shriek figures are. And it's like Sasha said, the key example to think about is like the case of like the projective space on a vector space, including into V mod GM. So in this case, Taylor shriek is actually defined on the category of D modules. And the reason is because I have GM equivariance here, any D module here, if I think of it as a D module on V, it's a D module on V minus 0, which is GM equivariant. So it's sort of constant in the radial directions, right? And so because of that, you don't have this issue of like it sort of looks constant and in particular holonomic in the radial directions. When I do this Taylor shriek, it actually is the point. So this is the kind of picture. This is what these truncatable kind of strata look like. But it's a very stacky situation. This never happens for schemes, this kind of thing. So that's, yeah, like I said, Carol. Great.
Are there any questions? Anyone on Zoom? Just type in the chat. Stop the speaker.
All right, thanks everybody.